The Roaring Twenties came crashing down in fashion, fitting for a decade of careless partying, decadence, and binge buying on Wall Street. For years, the stock market roared and raced ever upward, making many ordinary investors millionaires. And the wisdom of the times was that it would never end, until it did. In October of 1929, over just a few days, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. Billions of dollars were lost as the closing curtain descended on the Roaring Twenties and ushered in the worst economic depression the country has ever experienced. But how could such a surging, wealthy economy come crashing down so violently? Well, that's the treasure we're here to discover. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Humans. Throughout the 1920s, there was a near decades-long bull market, meaning a rapidly growing economy and stock market. It became a sporting event, with people following the rising stock prices, the millions being made, anxiously reading the papers for tips and leads, and the New York Stock Exchange was the arena where they played and where the spectacle happened. In the last 4 years of the decade, the stock market grew with particular speed. More and more Americans began throwing their savings into the stock market, hoping to be a part of the exhilarating race to riches. However, it's important to know even by 1929, the far majority of Americans owned no stocks at all. Still, inside the stock exchange, day in and day out, investors and brokers hungrily bought and sold in a marvel of what appeared to be a new expansion of wealth and prosperity that simply would never end. Look, throughout the 20s, many drank bootleg liquor and bathtub gin, but what the country was really drunk on was this illusion, that on Wall Street, anyone could be rich with no risk. For Americans with little or no savings, buying on margin became increasingly popular, which is just pretty much buying stocks on credit. Putting as little as 10 to 25% down and borrowing the rest from banks or brokers, this was a shortcut to riches. Over $8.5 billion in stocks were from margin loans by 1929, more than all the currency that was in circulation at the time. Now imagine, say, the stock market didn't just keep going up and up and up forever and, say, rather imploded. Well, I could see it being a devil of a time paying back those loans with the fact that there wasn't enough money in circulation to even pay them back. Wonder how that will play out. And that brings us to our exploration question for today, which is, what caused the stock market crash and why did this lead to the Great Depression? But to answer that, we got some history to shovel first. Dig it? When we reflect on the 1920s, we remember the dazzle and the dancing, but it's a wise student of history that remembers behind the spectacle, there was warning signs of trouble ahead. The Great Depression simply just did not come out of nowhere when the stock market crashed. All was not rosy, and the bull market was not felt by everybody. In fact, some were straight bulldozed by it. The great majority of African Americans still lived in the states of the former Confederacy with few opportunities or freedoms, and most were locked in cycles of generational poverty on sharecropping farms. And then there were the millions of immigrants still suffering in stifling ghettos and tenements. And then there were rural Americans who still went without running water, electricity, or any of the basic consumer goods of the era. And then, in the late 1920s, while the stock market was shooting off to new heights, the rest of the economy began to slow as lurking problems surfaced. These were the other factors that helped lead to the Great Depression. There was the uneven distribution of wealth, as was just described. There was also an overproduction of goods, meaning that the factories producing cars and radios and refrigerators and furniture had produced too many goods for consumers to buy. And if no one is buying, production needs to slow down and people lose their jobs. On top of that, many consumers were in debt from buying goods on installment plans and on credit. And because of this, unemployment was trending upwards. Simply put, the foundations of the economy by the late 1920s was no longer on solid ground. And for Joe American in a farm down south or out west or in a city slum, they knew it. But the investor class began living in a different world, detached from the real economy. But their delirious optimism was about to facepalm into reality. The stock market hit its all-time high in the late summer of 1929. It was a fittingly bizarre year to end a wild decade. As the stock market peaked, the nation was experiencing some rather weird fads. For instance, there was the dance marathons that swept the country, and then a fad of drinking sauerkraut juice. And weirdest of all was the pole sitting contest, where kids would sit for days on end on a pole. 14-year-old William Ruppert was the pole sitting champ of the year, setting the record and earning all the, I'll go with pride, that goes with sitting on a pole for a whopping 23 days. So the next time your parents say you're wasting time on TikTok or Instagram, tell them you can be more like grandma or grandpa and just go sit on a pole for the better half of a month. But even the exhilaration of pole sitting or sauerkraut drinking couldn't match the energy or excitement of the stock market. Warning signs be damned. Investors would be sleeping outside the doors of the exchange, waiting for them to open, not to miss a moment to buy and sell. But after years of exhilarating growth, the market began to drop with exceptional speed on October 24th on what became known as Black Thursday. A sell-a-thon began. A frenzy took over the exchange like had never been seen before, as worries led to fear that turned to panic. Investors trampled one another, rushed to cash in their losses before they plummeted further. The ticker tape that recorded stock prices could not keep up with the volume of sales. In seconds, fortunes were lost. The place was a circus of screams, moans, and shouts. In a few hours, $10 billion was lost. And like the fiery explosion of a supernova before collapsing into a black hole, the exchange floor ran mad with men in suits that burst with shrieks and howls, and then fell into a stunned silence of disbelief and despair. A crowd gathered down the street at the House of Morgan and the other titans of banking and finance, praying for a miracle and looking to shore up the losses and restore some confidence to quell the panic. Some fat cat swaggered in and began throwing millions around, buying huge numbers of stocks in key American industries like U.S. Steel, AT&T, General Electric, Radio Corporation of America. And in the closing hours, the market bounced back a little. A dose of hope remained. The bankers had pulled up the market so that it only fell by 6% by day's end. But it didn't last. Days later, on Black Tuesday, the floor fell out once and for all. A record 16 million shares were sold, a number that wouldn't be matched for 40 years, and $30 billion was lost over the course of just a week. Thousands upon thousands of investors, some of whom had been millionaires days before, were wiped out clean. Left broke if they were lucky, or worse, in debt to margin bets with no hope to pay them back. Many small investors who had taken loans against their houses or pooled their family savings were left with nothing. Their life's work, all they had and hoped, up in smoke. Some fell to such despair that they took their very lives. The bull market gave way to the bear market of declines. President Hoover, Wall Street fat cats, and some others tried to reassure the nation that the market and the economy would surely bounce back. This was just a mild dip that would soon correct itself. And though they weren't even fooling themselves, no one at the time would have dared guess that the crash would set in motion a 15-year depression that would become the worst in American history. After the stock market crash, other dominoes began to fall. Banks had invested much in the market and faced massive losses. And between late 1929 through 1933, 9,000 bank failures occurred, wiping out millions of more people's savings. Similar to the panic that occurred during the crash, if there's worries that a bank may fail, customers rush to withdraw their deposit in what's called a bank run. And with so many customers all rushing in at once, the bank, who had lent out most of the money, fails. By 1933, about 30% of the banks in the country had been wiped clean. Such a visible collapse of the financial world replaced the foolish optimism of the 20s with a frightened despair. Consumer spending and consumer confidence plummeted as families clung to whatever money they had and hid it under their mattresses rather than in banks. With consumer spending dropping, industries who were already overstocked had to cut more employees, and more American families were left without income, further deepening the crisis. African Americans, who were often the last hired and the first fired, felt the sting of the Depression the earliest, but it would soon affect almost all Americans. Historians and economists still debate just how much of an effect the stock market crash had on causing the Depression. It clearly was not the only cause, but the best metaphor that I find helpful to understand this was explained by Robert McElvine. When someone becomes ill after catching a chill, it is not the cold itself that causes the sickness. Rather, the cold reduces the body's resistance to microorganisms already present in it, which are able to cause the illness. Some such role is the proper one to assign to the crash. The cold wind that swept through lower Manhattan in October and November 1929 lowered the economy's resistance to the point where already existing defects could multiply rapidly and bring down the whole organism. And I think there's quite a few lessons for us to learn from this about ensuring the health of our economy and our society, about the dangers of a Wall Street that is wildly detached from Main Street America, and gross disparities in wealth between the rich and the poor, and a deranged romanticizing of material wealth. Thank gosh that's no longer the case. And that there are ways to insulate ourselves from future crashes. And studying the lessons of history will surely help our endeavors. And the impacts of the Depression and the Dust Bowl that ripped through America will be tackled in depth next episode. And until then, thanks for engaging today. This has been History for Humans. And now what you've all been waiting for. Dad jokes in history! Amidst all the chaos on Black Thursday, how did investors know that it was the start of a bear market? Because it was pure pandemonium. Pandemonium? But all horrible kiddings aside, if you could just click the thumb that looks like this, it would help me, a teacher, keep making these videos, and you'll be notified of every episode if you click the subscribe button, and you can be a part of the History for Humans tribe. And then, of course, you can always head over to our website, historyforhumans.com, to carry on the conversation with students from around the country. And for teachers, there's lessons and resources and a ton of freebies there as well. And if you're doing a learning activity, hang out because we got instructions in just a hot second. Okay, today's lesson, you're going to be completing some stations to analyze the causes of the Great Depression. Each station is going to teach you a different cause or underlying factor that led to the Great Depression and allow you to dig a little deeper and explore history on your own. Each station has at least 2 different documents. Some are primary source texts and others are secondary sources. And each source has at least one visual, a photograph to analyze, a political cartoon, or some graphs. And you're going to be answering questions about each station on your worksheet. And in part 2, you're going to be creating an original image that represents the causes of the Great Depression. You don't have to be a great artist to do well on this. You just have to put in effort and to think creatively and try to find a way to represent the major causes in a unique way. All right, guys, I want you to pretend like it's 1929 and drop it like it's stocks. Stocks. See you next time.